Hello, all, and welcome to week two of this home group mini series that we're doing, considering some of the lessons from this book on emotionally healthy spirituality by Pete Scazzero. Last week we started off by thinking about the idea of self knowledge and how we need to see ourselves and understand ourselves and know ourselves in God's terms, rather than sometimes the terms that we kind of create for ourselves or that we allow others to impose on us. And we really looked at the idea of Jesus' temptation, the temptation toward control or power or autonomy or independence from God, and Jesus' refusal to embrace that and to accept God's verdict on him as a beloved son. And this week, week two, if last week, we could call last week sort of no self, this week we're going to call it no weakness. Because last week we thought about the idea that we are fundamentally children of God, that's our fundamental identity. There's a sort of a flip side to some of that as well, because we see in Genesis 3 that everything isn't a bed of roses, but is actually because of the fall, kind of infected with curse everywhere. And part of that is, as we think about understanding ourselves, we've just got to recognize that we have limits, and we have vulnerabilities, and we have weaknesses, and we have struggles. And most of the stuff I'm going to talk about today comes from one of the other Pete Scazzero books, which is Emotionally Healthy Church. And in this one, he encourages Christians, as part of our self-knowledge, to develop a theology of weakness. And in doing so, he quotes 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about his own struggle. And he says this, Paul says to the Corinthians, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" 4 times in those 4 verses, Paul uses the word weakness, and interestingly kind of flips it into being in and of itself a strength. Our weaknesses are not entirely negative. Our limits have sort of strength in them, because they make us, or they should drive us to our knees. They should drive us to be more dependent on God's power in our lives. And so we're just going to kind of think about that, develop some of those ideas for a bit. Pete Scazzero in this other book, the first one I mentioned, he gives a list of the way in which we experience limits. He says our physical body is in and of itself a limit. It limits what we can do, our physical abilities, our family of origin, the way in which we've been brought up, our genes, our ethnicity, our culture, will all have its own strengths and its own weaknesses. Your marital status, if you're married or single, will come with some opportunities, but also some limits. Your intellectual capacity, your talents and gifts, your material wealth will be a limit. Your time, your work and relationship realities, and your spiritual knowledge or understanding. All of these are different ways, Pete Scazzero says, that we experience what it is to be limited. And he then gives 3 ways which we tend to respond to our limits when we become aware of our limits. 3 wrong ways to respond to our limits. The first thing he says is some of us flee from the idea of weakness or limit. We flee by burying our pain in some form of addictive behaviour. We avoid difficulty, we avoid facing up to limit and weakness by embracing something else or throwing ourselves into something else. And so we run away or never really face up to our own limitations. The second wrong response to limits or weaknesses is, he says, we fight them. We can become angry and we can become bitter. We can mask our own insecurities, sometimes with a sense of sort of brashness, overconfidence, self-righteousness. If we find ourselves getting easily angry with other people or talking a lot about their shortcomings or being judgmental, sometimes that is a way of masking or fighting our own sense of inadequacy and weakness. And the third thing is, the third wrong way of responding to weakness is many of us try and hide them. We build sort of towers around ourselves in such a way as to cover up how damaged, cracked, fractured, frail, limited and imperfect we are. In fact, he goes on to tell a story about that was his own experience. We don't want to let anyone else in, and so we put on a veneer that says everything's okay. We're worried about what other people will think about us or say about us, so we're never really vulnerable with each other. We never really admit to the areas in which we struggle or in which we are weak or limited. And so a little later, Pete Scudero says, how do you discern your weaknesses? I guess some of us are painfully aware of our weaknesses, but for others of us, some of these things are blind spots that we need to kind of open ourselves up to. And so he says, he's got a little section in this book, Emotionally Healthy Church, learning to discern my limitations. He says, look at your personality. Are you introvert or extrovert? Are you a creative person or a task-driven person? Are you more of a kind of a nurturing personality or more of a kind of a go-getter pioneer? What are your? If you can discern your personality and its strengths too, you'll quickly come to work out the things that you're not so great at. He says, look at your season of life. He quotes Ecclesiastes where it says there's a time for everything in Ecclesiastes 3. It says, look, different seasons of life will bring new opportunities, but also some limits. It may be a particularly pressured job, which will limit some of the things you can do. It may be a season of ill health, or a season of parenting. You may be one of those folks with kind of elderly parents and children and grandchildren you're looking after. There's a sort of a limit, a limiting factor to that. It says, look at your emotional, physical and intellectual capacities and just be honest. Some of us have a massive capacity for work. Some of us don't. Some of us are particularly resilient emotionally. Some of us aren't. And he says, one of the things he says, which is really useful, is it's critical we don't judge other people's capacities by our own. And we just recognise that different people will experience weakness and limits differently to us. And he says, look at your scars and wounds from family past. For some of us will have had great upbringings, some of us less so. And some of that will have caused pain and harm in our lives. Interestingly, he says, when I learn to embrace those things, actually I find myself more dependent on God, more sensitive, less judgmental of others. I love others better, and I learn to encourage them more. So there's ways in which we need to recognise our limits and weaknesses and be honest about them. That's a key component of self-knowledge. But to embrace those things as actually, in their way, strengths, ways in which God works in our weakness, rather than rejecting them, fleeing them, fighting them, hiding from them, learning to embrace some of our own limitations. A little later on in the chapter, he talks about this idea of allowing our weaknesses to bring out the good that God has for us. And he lists some of the changes that come through embracing weakness. If we embrace weakness, we have a greater capacity to wait on God and surrender to his will. If we embrace our own weaknesses, we are kinder and more compassionate. If we embrace our weaknesses, we are less covetous, less idolatrous. If we embrace weakness and limits, we are liberated from the need to impress others. If we embrace our limits, we are able to live more comfortably with mystery when it comes to God and his plans. When we recognize weakness, we are characterized by a greater humility and brokenness. And when we embrace our limit and weakness, we sense the reality of heaven in a new way. He goes on, we have a greater sensitivity for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the marginalized. And finally, when we embrace our limits, we are more at home with ourselves and with God. And I guess that's why Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 12, I will boast in my weaknesses so that Christ's power might rest in me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses. So you're going to spend a bit of time in groups. I've given your group leader some questions just to reflect on some of these ideas, self-knowledge, and particularly that this emotionally healthy spirituality that comes with knowing and embracing our limits and our weaknesses.